operate this. Okay, welcome to our colleagues and friends here in the CAARI Library and online, and thank you for joining us for our lecture series. I'm Lindy Crew, CAARI's director. And it's my pleasure this evening to introduce our speaker, Professor Steve Falconer. And next time we're going to be using a mouse with this piece for us Mac people to have a struggle. Professor Falconer is currently on a research visit to Cyprus as a Fulbright scholar, so we're fortunate to have this opportunity to hear about his work. Since 2015, Steve has held the post of professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. Prior to this, he was professor of archaeology at La Trobe University in Melbourne, incidentally where I took my undergraduate degree, and he's also worked at Arizona State University in addition to holding various research fellowships in Jordan, Australia, Cyprus, and the US. Professor Falconer has published several books, including the results of his fieldwork at the important site of Tel El Hayat in Jordan, and edited volumes on rural life and early states in the Bronze Age Levant. He has also published around 75 articles on Cyprus and Jordan, many in collaboration with his students and team members on a range of subjects, including radiocarbon dating, subsistence strategies, environment, and early economies. He has been the recipient of many prestigious research grants and served on numerous committees and boards, including the CAARI Board of Trustees, and chairing the Committee on Archaeological Research and Policy of the American Society of Overseas Research. Steve, along with the co-director for many of his projects, Pat Fall, is currently working on a book entitled Ancient Canaan, Landscapes and Lifeways of Early Civilization, to be published with Cambridge University Press. We are all excited to hear this evening about Steve and Pat's now complete excavations at this exceptional Bronze Age settlement near Politico as they work towards publication of the site. I would now like to invite Professor Falconer to present his lecture this evening entitled Bronze Age Life and Landscape at Politiko-Troullia, Cyprus. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lindy, and thank you everyone who has come out to join us here in Nicosia tonight, and for everyone online. It's nice to see some familiar faces in the audience here and names on the screen up there as well online virtually. We'll be talking about our work. I'll be talking about our work at Politiko-Troullia, which we've conducted over a number of years, and some of it, well, all of it, would have been impossible without the help, encouragement, support, friendship, and magnanimous generosity from a variety of people. So archaeology really is a team sport, and we have a big team to offer thanks to from a variety of places, including the Department of Antiquities, CAARI, our home village of Nice, both the people there, colleagues there, school students, teachers, friends, a variety of people who've made all this work possible. And of course, our staff and students, very numerous and multinational. It's been a joyous experience working here in Cyprus. Okay, we're going to be concentrating our discussion tonight on the site of Politiko-Troullia, which is shown on the map here. Right, I'm going to be pointing over here because I'm told the laser pointer doesn't work too well for the online audience. And this map also includes a variety of important Bronze Age sites, particularly those that supply radiocarbon dates and allow us to work with revised chronologies for the Bronze Age on the island of Cyprus. Politico is located in the Pillar Lavas, the foothills of the Troodos Mountains here. The Pillar Lavas are important geologically in our context because they're copper bearing. And one of the reasons that Troullia existed has to do with copper, as we will see. The site we're talking about is kind of an non-traditional site in a sense, because it includes this portion of Politiko-Troullia over here, under the mown wheat fields shown in the lower right corner. That effectively is the settlement portion, constituent portion of the site, but a great deal of the site also extends over this hillside here with all the terraces on it, which is called Politiko-Troullia. These terraces hold back small plots of arable land, and as we'll see also, they provide, this context also provides a great deal of the archaeological signature in the locality. So the place that we're talking about might be considered an archaeological site, and it extends over about 20 hectares. That includes a vast area with a very pronounced archaeological material culture signature. So one of the things we did in choosing the site was we consulted previous archaeological surveys, in particular the Sydney Cyprus survey, which indicated that the site here, just upslope of Ios Heracleidos Monastery, and upslope of Iron Age Thomasos. Effectively, what we're looking at here perhaps might be considered Bronze Age Thomasos. Had a rich archaeological deposition across the modern surface. We sensed that by doing a pedestrian survey, picking up pottery and other material culture. And the results of that are shown diagrammatically here. So this is the portion of the plot here that's Politiko-Troullia, where the buried settlement is. And these are the terraced hillside fields of Politiko-Troullia. So you can see from these heat maps, in which we've taken point data and interpolated between the values at various points to create greater and lesser concentrations of pottery. Point out over in the village, we've got several pockets of concentrated material culture, which we use to target our excavation units. And then on the terraced hills and plateaus at Politiko-Troullia, we also see a fairly distinct signature. So there was a lot of behavior going on the terraced hill slopes, hillsides of Politiko-Troullia, as well as within the settlement of Politiko-Troullia. We chose our excavation units in part based on the results I've just shown you as part of our results. And you can see our units laid out here in what we've come to know as Politiko-Troullia West, North, and East. We'll talk about each of those three fields in that order tonight. And then, as I mentioned, we've got all these terraced hillsides here. These are probably hill terracing for creation of small arable plots. Smaller terrace walls over here to retain hill slope wash from effectively washing over the archaeological site in antiquity. We'll be sharing a number of artistic depictions done by Gary James, our project artist, former archaeological student at La Trobe University, now archaeological artist, if you will. This is effectively a conception of what the site might have looked like, the settlement might have looked like in antiquity, with at the south end of the settlement, looking north, that's the silhouette of the CAARI Mountains in the distance. And you can see in the foreground, these terraced, walled arable plots cascading down the hill slope toward the settlement. And then three areas, this is Troullia West, North, and East. These are all effectively isometric projections of what we actually did excavate. We also included this enclosure here. This is something that we saw clearly while doing soil resistivity surveying. We never actually excavated it, but we saw it repeatedly, so we know it's there. We also know by virtue of doing soil resistivity over the entire site that there are areas that don't have buildings. So this is a very non-aggregated settlement. It's dispersed. And as we'll see, it tends to move laterally through time as well as being stratified through time. Okay, our excavations produce stratified sediments up to, and actually in some cases, more than 3 meters deep, which is relatively substantial by Cypriot standards. We're more used to that in the Levant. And these 6 strata, we identified 6 strata. We number them, perhaps not helpfully, from the bottom, from the top down. So the earliest stratum is phase 5, followed by 4, 3, 2, 1B, and 1A in order, moving more recently in time. We have 25 radiocarbon dates from charcoal and mostly seeds. And we use Bayesian modeling, as shown on the right here, to come up with the best possible radiocarbon model of chronology for the site, which stretches more or less from the 21st century BC, about 2050, to about 1850 BC. So this is the heart of the occupation of the site, something like 200 years over 6 phases. The phases measure something on the order of 25 to 30 years each. And if we look at the literature on lifespans in antiquity, these are effectively one generation. So we're seeing a generation by generation by generation turnover as the site develops. Buildings are built, remodeled, abandoned, rebuilt, remodeled again, and so on through time. And I make note here, the earlier portion of the occupation runs between about 2050 and 1980 BC. We'll keep an eye on that date here because that's kind of an interesting one, as we'll see shortly. And then the latter 3 phases run from about 1980 to 1850. If we compare the radiocarbon chronology for our settlement with the other major radiocarbon dated Bronze Age settlements on Cyprus, the results look something like this. So at Troullia, the brown colored bar here represents the heart of the radiocarbon chronology for our site based on 23 radiocarbon dates. 2 of our dates were statistical outliers, so we were allowed to remove them for purposes of modeling. The other 2 best dated sites are at Sotira Communia here, which offers us 10 dates early in the Bronze Age, roughly from about 2350 to almost 2200, and then a longer sequence at Marchialonia based on 17 dates, which then overlaps with our settlement and chronology for Politiko-Troullia, datas 5 through 1A. So you have kind of a stair-step overlap between these 3 best dated early and middle Bronze Age, or to use the newer nomenclature, Prehistoric Bronze Age 1 and Prehistoric Bronze Age 2 sites. The ceramic assemblage here is dominated by red polished ware, which you're not seeing here, by the way. But anywhere from about 85 to 90% of the ceramics from all 6 phases are red polished ware of one form or another. The major sort of change in the pottery seriation at the site comes with the latter 3 phases of the site, in which we see the appearance of white polished ware, first in small numbers in phase 2, and then increasing to about 8% of the assemblage in phase 1A. That's for those of you who are pottery aficionados. And these are a couple of some of the nicer examples of white paint here that is especially common in what we call Politiko-Troullia East. Okay, so we've got a little bit of the background, the setting for the settlement, and our chronological structure that we're applying here. Let's have a look at these 3 fields and what they tell us. And the first one we'll be looking at is what we call Politiko-Troullia West. This is a photograph of the major architectural features here, which are 2 large open courtyards labeled here. We figure they're open because they're relatively massive. They're 8 by 12 meters in size. There are, as far as I can tell, no good examples of roofed spaces in Bronze Age settlements of this size elsewhere. And ethnographic documentation suggests, again, that you generally don't see roof spaces over about 3.5, perhaps 4.5 meters wide. So they're open spaces. At the base, at the south end of them, around here between these 2 walls, runs an alleyway running down slope that would have taken the occupants of Politiko-Troullia down to the waters of Camaras Creek, which is over where you see the trees on the far right of this photograph. I'm going to come back to that in just a moment as well. Here's a drone photograph of the same area, giving you a sense of where the courtyards are. This is a few years later in excavation. And the important thing, 2 things that we'll talk about briefly. First of all, there's an intramural well within the village. And then secondly, there's a complex up here, which represents the very last episode of occupation of the site prior to its abandonment. The well looks like this. This is what it looked like in the course of excavation. And here's Gary, one of Gary's renderings of it to the far right here. Basically, what you see here in the field on your left is just above that meter stick there, we have sliced longitudinally through a wall that bounded the entrance to the well, as shown in Gary's drawing on the right. So there are two stone pillars, in between which is a threshold, which opened up and would have offered a gateway coming down to some steps leading down to the well waters. In antiquity, you can perhaps barely make out the mud brick coursing between those two stone towers, stone pillars, that which was laid in when the well was abandoned and that gate was blocked up. On the right was the second entryway. So basically what we have here is a well which perhaps might have offered more potable waters for the villagers or the occupants of Politiko-Troullia than the waters of Carbonized Creek, if one imagines in antiquity conditions that might have held true. This is another rendering here. Again, once again, this is the gate we've been looking at for the most part, and that's the entryway that would have led from the northern courtyard down to the well. In the latter phases, the last three phases of occupation here, the well was capped. It was covered over with a limestone cap, making it a pretty impervious cap, meaning that the well was no longer accessible. Started wondering why that was. And we started thinking about that. If we look first at the architecture and stratigraphy, on the right, you see a series of walls that bounded the courtyards, and they're labeled according to their stratigraphic phases. So during phases 4 and 3, the lower walls were in use, as was the well. In phase 2, the well was capped, and the entire architectural complex was moved upslope about 1 meter to 1.5 meters. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot, but we think what's going on has to do with the creek. The radiometric date for the transition from phase 3 to 2 comes in, as we've seen, at about 1980 BCE. And we attribute the change to erosion caused by increased runoff and downcutting in Carbonized Creek, all along the edge of the site here, which would have eroded back. In fact, we find eroded wall ends all along here. That was one of the first tip-offs that we had a buried archaeological site here. And what we think is going on is right about at this time, in the years just after about 2000 BC, we're seeing increased runoff, downcutting, massive erosion in localized settings like this. This creek running along this minor fault line was particularly susceptible to that kind of erosion. In response, the villagers had to move their village back up away from the stream. The timing is interesting because it coincides with changes in vegetation and climate that we've modeled in the southern Levant at about 2000 BC, coincident with what we think was increased precipitation. And that all was an event that sort of an amelioration or response to and had the aftermath of what's called the 4.2K event. That is 4.2 thousand years ago. There was massive region-wide drying, and after that phase passed, there appears to have been some punctuated increases in rainfall and decrease in temperature. So it's kind of a bounce back or response to the climate change that's being hypothesized 200 years earlier. And it leads to these kinds of massive geomorphological changes. Okay, let's think about the behavior that's going on in these courtyards. Here's Gary's rendering of the southern courtyard with its entryway from the alley down here. He rather graphically populates the alley with a lot of household debris, which truly it did contain. An awful lot of animal bones, broken pottery, small items, personal items lost along the way, jewelry, sewing needles, things that you wouldn't expect to find, except in the case of inadvertently deposited rubbish. This courtyard is particularly informative for a number of reasons. First of all, it gives us a really distinct faunal footprint, if you will, massive amounts of deer bones from Mesopotamian fallow deer. These deer bones are really interesting. Here, on the upper center here, that cute ceramic looking item from the Chesnola collection as a rendering, perhaps, of a deer. And then I always like one of my favorite pieces in Cyprus is the Troodos bowl down here in the foreground. projecting and giving you a graphic representation of a communal collective event of the sort that we all celebrate periodically. So the southern courtyard is chock full of debris. And a lot of that debris is animal bone. And most of that animal bone is from Mesopotamian Falconer. And we're getting entire carcasses, complete skeletons that have been brought there, slaughtered, butchered, and consumed as far as we can tell. So these are not just choice cuts of meat brought in. It's the whole production process, the whole butchering process is represented here. And so what we're looking at is a signature of feasting. And that feasting is associated with some other very interesting material culture. There are a number of gaming stones, as shown in the lower right here. In some cases embedded into the surfaces here, elsewhere standing freeform, which would have been focal points for groups to get together, play and converse. Pat and I are currently living in a relatively small town, and the platea there is populated by the modern rendition of gaming stones, not really. There are card tables with the men sitting around, drinking coffee, playing cards, playing backgammon, shooting the breeze, sharing gossip and politics. And you have to imagine the same thing would have been going on here 4,000 years ago. In addition, we have some really special material culture. For example, at the lower left here, a really interesting Ascos pitcher. This is a form of pitcher that's a zoomorphic depiction. In this case, it's a partridge. Unfortunately, the partridge has lost its head and spout. But if we look at parallels elsewhere, it looks like these are ritual vessels probably used for pouring oils and unguents and things like that. We also see a great number of one of the best parts of Cypriot Bronze Age archaeology are the plank figurines, the ceramic plank figurines, such as the one shown at the upper right here. These plank figurines are really interesting to my eye for a number of reasons, because they're depicted in a standard artistic motif. So a plank figurine has a characteristic feature, let's say, I suppose, like a school of painting might in the modern world, or a school of sculpture. But they also allow sufficient plasticity that you can effectively model individual features. That is, no two plank figurines are quite identical. So on the one hand, there's a kind of a class depiction here that's characteristic of the time, but there also is a little bit of individual portraiture going on at the same time. So there's a lot of telling us about who people are. In the upper left, we have a one-of-a-kind find from Politiko-Troullia. This is a stone plank figure, whereas the ceramic figurines are a few centimeters high, sometimes attached to a vessel or hung on the wall. Our plank figurine in the upper left here is 38 centimeters tall. It's relatively big, almost half a meter. And it's a really interesting depiction of the human form, very stylized. You could say it's minimally anthropomorphic. It's got two stubs of arms. And it's got, we can't quite tell its gender. We think this may be a woman, but it's hard to tell. And what makes it interesting is the stone plank figure and the other ones that we know of, for example, from the Cyclades and elsewhere from unprovenience context on Cyprus, are effectively gender ambiguous. They don't really tell us blatantly whether they're male or female. In fact, they may be fluid. They could be decorated, they could be adorned, they could be dressed up for different occasions and perform or provide different functions for different occasions. So you have this constellation of material culture along with some more material culture in the form of spindle whorls. And the spindle whorls here, again, are relatively interesting because they're highly depictive. They're elaborately decorated with incised lime-filled decoration. They come in a variety of sizes and shapes. They're used for a variety of spinning a variety of different kinds of threads, from flax to wool. And the iconographic potential here again is fairly great. People can tell us a little bit about who they are. In contrast, for example, in the Levant, spindle whorls tend to be just expedient. They're all potsherds, they're rounded and drilled, not artistically depicted at all. But here they are. They're serving a different function. So this gets back to a notion that a woman named Daisy Knox wrote about in her dissertation. in 2012. She talked about an ideology of textile production. And I think she's kind of onto something here. It's a conflation of ideology, identification, that is group identification, individual identification, is wrapped up in textile production, and in this case also complemented by this massive feasting. And if you stop and think about it, when we unconsciously, subconsciously tell us about who we are, oftentimes it has to do with celebrations that honor a calendric event of some sort, a family event. What do? You get together with friends and family, and you eat a lot and you drink a lot, and you do so in prescribed ways. So every American knows about Thanksgiving, for example. Every Australian celebrates Anzac Day today in a different way, but they celebrate it, using common customs and in group settings like this, which oftentimes involve feasting. Okay, so basically that's a big component of our behavioral inference that's coming from the courtyards in Politiko-Troullia West. Just adjacent to those courtyards is another area that's interesting and may play into the same scenario. It looked like this during excavation in our last two field seasons. You can see stone wall foundations here, lined with mud brick bins, large storage jars, oftentimes placed in floor surfaces like this. We thought of it originally in kind of generic terms in terms of a workshop or storage area, but we've been inspired by talking with Elizabeth Haying during her time here to consider the possibility that this might have been a dyeing workshop. That is, we're looking at small vats of the sort that Elizabeth uses to dry out her mineral pigments, for example, to create pigments for decoration. And what better to decorate than pottery, perhaps, although that's not being attested directly here, but perhaps also textiles. And if you think about textiles, textiles are a great way that people tell you about who they are and where they come from. So here's what this complex looked like during excavation. Here is the interior workshop area. There's also an associated external space out here with a platform for an upright pillar or post, a stone platform on the right with a whole series of very nice juglets and bowls associated with them, left in an in situ assemblage here on abandonment and burned. So this is the very last episode that we're able to document at the site, just prior to the burning of this portion of the site and the overall abandonment of the facility. And here's what it looks like from Gary's point of view. So once again, here's the interior space here, vats, jars. This is where we found these artifacts. So it gives you a good sense of what these looked like as they were left at the time the place was abandoned. And here's a drone photograph giving you a sense of the burning that went on in the association. Okay, we're going to turn our attention now from Politiko-Troullia West to Politiko-Troullia North. This is another area that we were inspired to excavate by virtue of our resistivity sampling that told us that we thought we had a fairly simple buried complex that might represent a domestic household, which we were kind of keen to find, or at least I was. Okay, this is what it looks like in Gary's rendering. It's basically a small single roofed room here, the exterior courtyard here. And we've excavated the foundation, the bottom bits of a terracotta domed oven, very much like, we think, the traditional domed ovens you still find in Cypriot household backyards today. So we thought perhaps we're onto something here. Farming household of the sort that we tend to think of as the constituent elements in agrarian villages. But the material culture associated with it didn't work with that interpretation. We don't have a lot of household backyard meal debris. Instead, we have massive amounts of metallurgical debris. And that metallurgical debris consists of ore fragments, slag fragments. These are tap slags tapped out of a furnace, representing removal of waste products from smelting copper. We have crucible fragments with solidified copper ore embedded in their pores. And on the right, a fragment of a tuyere. This is a portion of a pipe used for a bellows to introduce air into a furnace and increase its temperature and its ability to smelt. These are not particularly picturesque bits of archaeological evidence, at least perhaps not to the layperson's eye, but they're really informative for us because they tell us an awful lot about what's going on. And this is amplified by our work in the third portion of the site we're going to talk about right now, which is Politiko-Troullia East. Again, when we first excavated this portion of the site, this represents a roofed room with a door right here. In fact, the door's pivot went into a socket right there. With the second room here, an alley wending its way in this fashion, like this. In the back, where the arrows are all pointed, is an open, what was a sort of a portico, a covered courtyard that was used clearly for metallurgy. We have all the elements of the production process represented here, from a pit furnace shown there we're missing one of the notations. There's a pair of metal bronze tongs in the very far upper right there, used for holding a crucible when it's too hot to handle by hand. A limestone mold shown in the lower left here for casting a dagger, chisel, and an axe. And we found, again, copper ore, copper slag. We found a single piece of finished artifact. That's the haft of the dagger. That was actually found in the alleyway back in Politiko-Troullia West. So here we have evidence in this context for the entire production process, again, in a setting that we originally envisioned as a farming household. And here we have Gary's artistic rendition of the courtyard here, which would have been partially covered. A couple of people working on smelting here, another person casting here. The only covered space of the complex in this area here, here, and here. So we again the material culture and floor and faunal assemblages here just didn't seem to coincide with what we expected if this was just an agricultural household. Okay, so we can kind of stand back and think about the settlement in its setting. Here we've got another rendering, this case facing to the southeast. The area we just looked at is here. It's Politiko-Troullia East, north, and west, and this stockade that we've sensed with resistivity survey. And again, the sense that there were large, probably open spaces within the settlement, and that the settlement moved about a bit laterally through time. The hill slopes behind it on Politiko-Troullia are covered with orchards. We know this from doing sediment flotation and the recovery in particular, not so much sort of wheat and barley and annual crops, but perennial orchard crops, especially grapes and olives. And we figured those were populating the terraced hillsides of Politiko-Troullia. The smaller terrace walls here, holding back the slope or the sediments along the slopes of Politiko-Troullia, trying to hold it back from eroding onto the settlement. And in the right here, we have the course of Kamara's Creek wending its way by the settlement. And farther to the right would have been oak and pine and oak forest leading up into the Troodos foothills, where we would have had deer and pig that would have been available for hunting. So how do we detail how the people of Politiko-Troullia were managing their landscape? We started doing this through the use of stable isotope analysis, which is kind of a burgeoning area of archaeological science right now. And stable isotope analysis simply measures the relative quantities of various alternative isotopes of different elements. In this case, we are measuring different quantities of two isotopes of nitrogen, two isotopes of carbon. By the way, an isotope is just an alternate form of an element. Different isotopes vary by virtue of having different numbers of neutrons in their nuclei. So their electrical properties remain the same, their atomic mass differs. And that difference in mass varies in the way that plants metabolize them and the way that animals metabolize those plants varies according to a whole number of different variables. In general, the isotopes we've measured include nitrogen and carbon. Carbon tells us a little bit about plant sources. Nitrogen tells us a lot about soil management, especially fertilization. So in general, lower maintenance or lower, less managed animals will find their values down here. More managed or higher trophic level animals, including carnivores, will be up here. So when we start analyzing, this is basically an analysis based on 140 animal bones from Politiko-Troullia. Some really interesting patterns start to emerge. So what we have plotted here are mean values for carbon and nitrogen, and their standard deviations, which are these bars. The X and the diamond here represent sheep, goat, and sheep, and below that, goats. Now, what this tells us is that sheep are being more highly managed. They are consuming more nitrogen-enriched crops, probably from fields that may be manured, whereas goats, on the other hand, and if you're familiar with goats, you might, relative to sheep, this might sound reasonable, they're actually less managed. They're eating, they're browsers, they're not grazers, and they're browsing on fields that are less heavily managed and less fertilized. And they seem probably to be moving a little farther. Above that, more heavily managed are cattle. So cattle are definitely grazing either on fodder or more likely on manured or self-manured fields, probably in close proximity to the village. In contrast, we've got values for pig and deer down here. Now the pig are interesting because morphologically, the bones we can already see, they're pretty robust. We already had a pretty good idea they're probably not domesticated, they were feral. But this kind of clinches that argument because the values, the mean values for pigs and deer are very close together. We know the deer are wild. These deer, by the way, were introduced from Anatolia in the Neolithic and possibly reintroduced again in the Bronze Age, and then apparently let go. So they're not being husbanded close to the village, close to town, but they're being let go where they're being hunted. So this aspect of the animal, the faunal stable isotope data tells us there's a good deal of hunting going on, includes the deer and the pig. To the upper right are foxes, and foxes are they typically do have higher nitrogen and higher carbon values up in that direction. They are that's by virtue of the fact that they're occupying a higher trophic level among animals. They're carnivores. And in fact, we had a single owl bone, which we did not plot here, and it plotted way off to the upper right-hand corner. Because it is truly a dedicated raptor. It has an isotope signature in keeping with it. I sort of like the idea of the owl, and I hope we don't know what kind of owl it is, but you're probably all familiar with the sound of a Sculp's owl, the one that gives off the pinging sort of noises at night. It's also the owl that's the Athenian owl of wisdom. Sort of like the idea that maybe that's the kind of owl. Okay. Now, we can also compare data between different sites, and it can tell us about change between two very different modes of animal management. So the data shown in the orange is patterning, is the same patterning we just looked at from Politiko-Troullia. Our wild animals here, just a different scale. So deer, pig, and here we have sheep, and goat, and cattle. So our highly managed domesticates here, our wild animals here. And then these blue values, mean values, are from the Neolithic site of Iorcus near the south coast of Cyprus. It's a Neolithic site excavated by Alan Simmons and company. And they have a very similar assemblage of animals, but they're all clustered here. So they're eating a much more homogeneous diet. They're experiencing a much more similar style and degree of management, not nearly as bifurcated as we see in the Bronze Age. So Neolithic animal management is here. It's very similar. It's homogeneous. We haven't seen much specialization. Haven't seen sort of a broader niche concept in terms of animal management. But when we move to the Bronze Age, things change quite a lot. Okay. So here's, again, kind of an artistic depiction of what we've been talking about. So we're seeing Politiko-Troullia, where we're seeing arboriculture, animal herding and hunting at forest edge of the Troodos Mountains. All right, this brings us to what we're doing now. Pat and I are involved in the project, especially along with Suzanne Pilar-Birch and Elizabeth Ritter. That's Pat and Liz shown in the upper right there. And we are developing this approach to stable isotope analysis on a broader scale, spatially and temporally. So we are creating landscapes of isotopic variation in modern plants and water. And the reason we're doing this is that when we do isotope analysis on archaeological samples, those data that we generate don't tell us absolute values in terms of average annual rainfall or average annual temperature. They, however, can tell us about how ancient conditions differed from today's conditions. But in order to do that, you have to know what today's conditions are. So what we're doing is developing modern stable isotope baselines based on modern plant at the upper right and water samples from a variety of locations for the purpose of using those as kind of a reference point against which we can measure and compare the archaeological data we're generating. And we do so in a variety of places. We're trying to sample as broadly as we can. This is a sample map showing you of some of the locations we've sampled for rain, stream, and spring water in places like Cyprus, Lebanon, and Jordan. The black points are points we visited. The white points are from the GNIP network. That's the global network of isotopes in precipitation, which provide isotope values for modern precipitation from weather stations. And here's basically our study area. So we're carrying out this work in the Levant, shown on the far right, Cyprus, Sicily, and Sardinia, effectively spanning the Mediterranean from east to west. And we get a sense of the number of samples we've collected thus far at the bottom. So we're building up this network, as are lots of other people who are conducting similar lines of investigation. So we're getting to a point where we're reaching a kind of critical mass where we're going to be able to make some pretty interesting broad scale interpretations about agrarian responses to climate change in the past. Okay, and in doing so, what we're able to do, among other things, is really identify some really interesting contrasts. So this is a photograph of a Canaanite temple taken from our excavations at Tel El-Hayat, Jordan, that Lindy mentioned earlier. This temple dates to about the same time range as Politiko-Troullia's occupation. And Gary's rendering of the village in which it occurred is a really nice, gives you a nice sense of a temple village, possibly part of the temple estate, possibly part of an emerging polity in the northern Jordan Valley, amid a thoroughly anthropogenic landscape. So you have a very different, contemporaneous, but very different social and physical landscape, all happening right about the same time in the early second millennium BC. This is what the landscape looks like today. It gives you maybe a mental image of how it might have been in the past. Archaeologically, we know this was already thoroughly deforested. Certainly didn't have eucalyptus trees here. This was imported from Australia. But we can see from the floral and faunal data from our excavations, this was a deforested anthropogenic landscape in a way utterly different from what we're seeing at Politiko-Troullia, where you have fairly substantial pine and oak forests, wild animals. We're reminded of that by Gary in the foreground here, our settlement in the midground, and the terrace slopes of Politiko-Troullia in the background here. So really interesting contrasts in social and physical landscapes and how people are responding to an era of massive environmental dynamics. And we'll close with an acknowledgement of all the people and organizations who have sponsored our work, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Steve. That was absolutely fascinating. And I'm sure we have some questions. I know that maybe the way that light.